All right. Welcome, everyone. Hello and welcome. My name is Lauren Adams, and I'm a board member of the CFA Society of Detroit. Welcome to our March virtual event on the topic of COVID-19 vaccines, treatments, and undervalued biopharma. This should be a very exciting and timely event, and I'm eager to introduce you to our presenter in just a few moments. But before I do so, I wanted to give folks just a minute to join in on the webinar. And while that happens, I'd like to take this chance to highlight a few of our upcoming events. On April 13th, Danielle DiMartino Booth, CEO and Chief Strategist for Quill Intelligence, will discuss how US leadership has been called upon to rein in a Fed that is both compromised and acting well outside its legal mandates. That webinar should be very thought-provoking, so you'll want to be sure to mark your calendar and join in on that discussion. And on May 5th, First Trust senior economist Andrew Opdyke, who last spoke to our society in May of 2020, will discuss the outlook for both the financial markets and the US economy in the year ahead. Another virtual webinar that you'll want to be sure not to miss. And I'm really excited to announce we have 3 outdoor socially distanced networking events planned for this spring and summer. On May 6th, we're hosting a Topgolf event in Auburn Hills. On June 25th, we have scheduled our annual meeting at the Detroit Athletic Club, followed by a Detroit Tigers game. And on July 20th, we will host a golf outing at Oakland University in Rochester. Information about all these events is available on our website, and be sure to reach out there if you have any questions about upcoming events. Wonderful. So now we'll turn it over to the event of the day. Please let me introduce you to our distinguished speaker. Karen Andersen is a healthcare strategist for Morningstar Research Services, a wholly owned subsidiary of Morningstar Inc. She's responsible for biotechnology research. Before joining Morningstar in 2005, Karen received a master's degree in business administration from Rice University, where she served as a senior healthcare analyst for the MA Wright Fund and earned the distinction of Jones Scholar. She has scientific research experience in both academia at Rice University and the University of Queensland in Australia, and in the industry at Lexicon Genetics and a subsidiary of Genzyme. Karen also holds a bachelor's degree in biochemistry from Rice University, where she graduated magna cum laude, and is a member of Phi Beta Kappa and holds the Chartered Financial Analyst designation. She ranked first in the biotechnology industry and had the highest score overall in the Wall Street Journal's annual Best on the Streets survey in 2013, the last year the survey was conducted. We are so thrilled that she has agreed to share her expertise with us today. A very warm virtual welcome to the CFA Society of Detroit to Karen. Welcome, Karen.
Great. Thank you so much, Lauren, for that introduction, and it's great to be here. Yeah, I'm excited to offer a little bit of our perspective, Morningstar's perspective on COVID-19 therapies, COVID-19 vaccines, and then also kind of how this ties into our drug industry valuations right now. So summary slide, these are some of the takeaways that I hope you'll get from this presentation. So first of all, overall, we see the branded drug maker space as undervalued. We do see continuing pricing concerns, especially from a potential policy risk in the US, but we also see a lot of positive developments in terms of innovation and the pricing power that results from that, as well as goodwill stemming from COVID innovation, and particularly the vaccines that have been developed and are ending the pandemic. So first of all, in terms of the headwinds from COVID, you know that this space has been a lot less hit, I'd say, than a lot of other industries. We originally, back in April, I think we estimated less than a 2% hit overall in terms of our impacts to our fair value estimates, or our estimates of the intrinsic value of these companies. And then we also saw, you know, further down the road, only the potential for, you know, on the highest end, a 1.5% impact to industry sales, as some patients might be moving to some lower price categories like Medicaid. But overall, in terms of the upside, in terms of the sales that these companies might be seeing due to COVID, it's really 2 buckets: treatments and vaccines. So treatments, we've estimated about a $10 billion market in 2021. And so a lot of this is coming from Gilead's drug Veklury, but also some of the targeted antibodies and antibody cocktails that we've seen coming out, the ones leading the way coming from companies like Lilly and Regeneron. The vaccine market is much bigger. So we're, the most recent numbers that we've estimated, we're seeing this at potentially over a $50 billion market just in 2021. And that's with Pfizer and their partner BioNTech, as well as Moderna. Each of those two mRNA vaccines looking at approaching 20 billion. But then also vaccines from J&J, Astrazeneca, Novovax also contributing. We expect overall vaccinations for about 2.6 billion people globally this year. I'm also going to talk a little bit about herd immunity. So this is a topic that was very hot for a while, and now I think that a lot of experts have kind of retreated and are kind of lowering expectations in this respect. But I do think, at least in the US, herd immunity is possible midsummer. Globally, it is looking less likely due to lower efficacy of some vaccines and also spread of new variants. Also, I'm going to talk a little bit more about policy shifts, although it's a little bit off topic. There are a couple of areas where we see the most likely changes to get through under the Biden administration. These are ideas that had been proposed a couple of years ago and did have some bipartisan support. And I think there's probably more likelihood that they could get through in given the current state of Biden's control and the Democratic control of Congress. And then I wanted to highlight a few names specifically, the key ones that we would point to right now, kind of among the branded drug stocks, especially the ones that have some COVID exposure. We would highlight Roche, Gilead, and Merck. And so this is just kind of a summary slide in terms of where we are right now for the large cap branded drug makers on valuation. So first of all, the two lines you see at the top of this graph, these are really looking at PE multiples for the industry. That's going to be in blue, and then the more orange color is the overall market. And so you can see, if this goes back 10 years, so you can see kind of around mid 2015 is when we started to see the multiples shift. So the drug companies went from having a slightly higher forward multiple to a slightly lower. And this was really when we started to see introduction of some rhetoric, some discussion of potential pricing reforms in the US. This was part of Hillary Clinton's campaign. And then that just really continued under the Trump administration, and that difference continues today. On valuation, where this bottom portion of the graph really looks at price to fair value estimates. So, below that line at price to fair value estimate of 1, we're seeing undervalued stocks. Above would be overvalued. So right now, well, as of the end of February, it looked like the branded large cap drug space roughly was about 15% undervalued versus the overall universe of stocks that we cover at Morningstar being fairly valued to perhaps slightly overvalued. And this is just a summary of some of the names that I'm going to be talking about today and our take on valuation at Morningstar. So overall, you can see we've got a range of star ratings. So several names here, though, do have 4 or 5 star ratings, putting them in a category of names that we see as undervalued. Most of the names here have wide moats, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about what moat ratings mean to us. And this is actually a wider range in market caps as well. I've included BioNTech in this group because of the COVID vaccine. So ranging for all the way from BioNTech all the way up to names as large and diversified as Johnson & Johnson. So here, just kind of highlighting how we think a little bit about moats. So as I mentioned, most of the large cap branded drug makers do have wide moats. And so here I'm going to go through kind of the reasons, kind of the pros and cons in terms of long-term competitive advantages and the ability of these companies to maintain very strong returns on invested capital. So the tailwinds, these drug firms have been over the past several years continuing to kind of refocus to make sure that they're focused on areas of unmet needs. So looking at areas where there's less competition, there's more desire to get products through as quickly as possible, and would be potentially higher market share and higher uptake. So we've seen innovation also with new modalities. So this is meaning basically new platforms, new types of drugs. A couple of ones to highlight would be things like CAR T, cell therapy. We've seen a few of these drugs introduced to treat different types of blood cancer. We have seen a couple of gene therapies introduced, like Novartis's Zolgensma. It's been approved to treat a rare condition that affects infants. And so we've seen, we're continuing to see new introductions of gene therapies and also more genetic-based treatments. This does kind of tie in as well with the mRNA vaccines that have recently been approved for COVID. And the FDA also, I think, has been more receptive to approving a lot of these drugs more quickly, given the unmet need and given some extremely positive data in a lot of these categories. The FDA often is willing to, review these in record time, sometimes just in 2 or 3 months instead of, a standard review that might take up to a year. And they might not require as much data. So they might allow these companies to file on phase 2 data where normally a larger phase 3 study might be required. I'd say on headwinds, we're looking at continued pressure. There's always going to be pressure on the industry as patents expire. And that can be biosimilar pressure on biologic therapies or generic pressure on the standard small molecule therapies. I mentioned also, regulatory and policy environment that's been kind of front and center in the US in terms of the potential changes that might be made there. And then there's always also going to be pressure from the pharmacy benefit managers or the PBMs and private payers in terms of their efforts to negotiate with drug companies, especially in more competitive areas, and get prices as low as possible. But we would say that overall, innovation is really what's been keeping pricing power relatively strong. It's going to continue to boost long-term demand for branded therapies. And it also lowers ESG risk and lowers the risk of substantial policy reform. So what we mean by that is that the kind of innovation we're seeing, especially, this has really been highlighted during COVID, is something that I think the administration and Congress and just the general public are recognizing as something that is a reason to support solid pricing in the industry for very innovative products, and to undertake sweeping reforms that would reduce prices substantially would, I think, risk to some extent our ability to continue to innovate at that level in the future, and our ability to be prepared for situations and pandemics like this in the future. So I think the industry overall has built up a significant amount of goodwill when it comes to protection against the more extreme potential policy reforms. And this is just an example. This comes from our annual pipeline report that we do every year for these companies. So this just demonstrates kind of over a 5-year period ending in 2024, where growth is really going to be coming from. So we separate out the drugs at these companies into really 3 categories: the ones that are losing patent protection, the ones that are already on the market and continuing to grow, and then new products that are going to be launching over the next few years. And you can see it's really the inline products are really what's driving growth. The pipeline, the newer therapies that are launching are essentially countering any hit that these companies are seeing on average from patent losses. So overall, that is supporting kind of a mid-single-digit growth profile. And then I mentioned returns on invested capital also being an important part of our moat ratings and the competitive advantages that we see these companies having. So this shows historically over the past few years where these ROICs have been, and forward looking over the next roughly 10 years where we see them going. Overall, we see them as very stable. You might notice in the later years a slight downward trend A lot of this is really due to the fact the way that we model these companies, we do have a lot less visibility on the kinds of drugs that are going to be launching, kind of past the 2025 timeframe. So there is less of an explicit modeling of drugs during this time. So this could be slightly overcounting the investment they're making and undercounting the return. So we think overall it looks like a very stable environment. And I will not go through this slide in detail because this is a lot of fine print, but hopefully you have access to this presentation if you're interested in reading more of our takeaways. But one thing I wanted to highlight, and when it comes to policy reform, was the different categories of reform and the potential impact. So I've made in a larger font the estimated impact industry sales for each of these. So essentially, I'd kind of put it in a couple of different categories. There's the more likely reforms that have a smaller impact, and then the more extreme reform that has a much larger impact. So starting with more likely reforms, the ones that we see as most likely are ones that have been included in past bills over the past couple of years, mostly tied to changes to Medicare. And so these would be things that would help make drugs more affordable for seniors. Drug companies might be on the hook for more of the catastrophic costs. So meaning, once drug sales get to a certain point, drug companies would have to be on the hook for the higher prices and the higher demand as the year goes on. And so these kinds of changes and potential caps on price increases would be having kind of a low to mid single digit impact on sales overall. The biggest impact, and the one that I think there's just been a lot of discussion on, but we see as being a much lower probability of getting through, would be something called international reference pricing or most favored nation pricing. And so this is something where the U.S. prices for drugs potentially across Medicare and across private covered drugs could be lowered to a level more similar to what we see in a lot of other developed countries. On average, drug pricing in the U.S. is roughly double what these other countries see. So if we were to see that happen, we would see drug companies have different exposure to the U.S. market as a percentage of their total sales, but on average, we would expect to potentially see a 24% impact on sales. So this would be an enormous impact. However, I think that we've already seen the proposal from Trump being shot down by judges, saying that essentially this was an overreach as a demonstration project. I think there's going to be a lot of lobbying against this sort of effort. And again, I think that there's a lot of goodwill in the industry to defend against this, given the sort of innovation we've been seeing coming from the industry. Not to mention the fact that I think there is a lot of support for the smaller changes that would help seniors better afford more expensive drug therapies. And then here now moving into COVID vaccines, I wanted to spend a little bit of time on this slide to kind of clarify how we're looking at the key program, the key vaccines that are out there and their efficacy and their strategies going forward. And so we already have in the US the 2 mRNA vaccines from Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna on the market, as well as the vector vaccine from J&J. We're seeing efficacy is kind of falling into, I'd say, perhaps 2 categories. So we've got the kind of mid 90% efficacy from the mRNA vaccines. And then the vector vaccines, so J&J's and also Astra's, which is not yet approved in the US, but approved in some other markets. Efficacy there looks like it might be more in the 60 to 70-ish% range. Novovax also has a vaccine using a different technology where they basically include the spike protein itself inside the vaccine. And so this is one that also does have phase 3 data outside the US that looked very strong. So it looked more on par, I'd say, with the mRNA vaccines. And that's one that could, along with the Astra's vaccine, these are vaccines that I think could get emergency use authorization in the second quarter. We're only including Novavax at this point, given a lot of the delays that Astrazeneca had seen and some of the safety concerns. I think one of the more important things to point out here, though, is efficacy against severe disease has been very strong, really across the board. And so, we've been seeing, higher than 80% efficacy against severe disease kind of across all of these programs. There's a little bit more limited data for Astrazeneca and Novavax at this point. They don't have a lot of data in older patients, especially in South Africa. But overall, I think that is very encouraging for our recovery from the pandemic. And then the variants have really been a hot topic, of course, in terms of fears that this may kind of stymie our ability to move past this with vaccination. So what I would say here, the data from Pfizer and Moderna, it's a little different because they finished their phase 3 trials before a lot of these variants were becoming more prevalent. So the data we have here is really kind of from test tubes. So taking samples from people who've been vaccinated and seeing how well that serum can defend against the virus. And what we've seen is the South Africa variant does appear to reduce the strength of protection, but it's still enough that it appears to protect and someone who had been vaccinated with those mRNA vaccines. J&J and Novavax actually have quite a bit of data because they just recently released data that had patients in South Africa. And so in these studies, it does look like reduced efficacy against patients having symptomatic disease, but I know, as I mentioned, very strong efficacy against defending against severe disease. And then the strategies, I think this is what's really going to be the focus going forward. The strategies for continuing to innovate here, I'd say, again, the mRNA vaccines are the most advanced. These Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna are the two companies that are already in development now with these next programs. So Pfizer right now is focusing on doing a third dose of their vaccine as a booster. And then also working on a variant vaccine that's to enter development. Moderna probably has the most comprehensive strategy so far. In development already, they do have a third dose, a booster for patients who were vaccinated more than 6 months ago. They have a variant vaccine in development, and then they also have one that combines the two in one vaccine. They're also working on a next generation vaccine that could be more stable at refrigerated temperatures, which would just make it much easier to distribute globally. I'd say J&J, Astra, and Novavax, they're all positioned as well to be able to adapt their vaccines and either come out with, boosters similar to what they've already released, or a vaccine that might include another piece that would defend against the variants we've been seeing. So all of those are probably going to be entering development later this year as well. So mRNA vaccines, though, I'd say, probably be seeing more data and potentially seeing these, third dose strategies coming out late this year. And then, as I mentioned, more than a $50 billion potential market this year. So this kind of outlines quarter by quarter what companies we see those sales coming from. So you can see again, Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna are really the two key companies, and you see the sales growing as we go through the year. A lot of those sales, Q1 and Q2, are going to be driven by the US market, but as time goes by, I think those sales are going to be more and more driven by supply to other developed markets around the world. And then going into 2022, this is really a combination of some of our assumptions around sales of boosters of the mRNA vaccines, but then also the sales in more developing countries from a wide, as you can see, it's a wider range. The sales are more spread among more companies, and these are going to be generally lower priced vaccines or across a lot of these more developing markets, but I think demand would actually remain high throughout 2022. And so some of our assumptions, assumptions on booster sales, that's really something that's, we're having to kind of reassess that every day as more information comes out. But for right now, we're only really assuming that this goes through 2023. So basically just one round of boosters. This could be something that, on one extreme, it could be we need boosters once a year. Something akin to flu shots. It could be something where we need boosters every 5 years, every 10 years, or this could be a situation where we do get to some kind of global herd immunity, or the virus evolves into something that's less dangerous or less contagious, and we don't need to keep giving people vaccines. So there's just really a wide range of potential outcomes that we see here, and it's something where we haven't been comfortable enough to commit to making this a kind of a recurring long-term market. But we do see for 2021, we do see 3 billion courses being sold, and 2.6 billion, as they mentioned, about 2.6 billion people being vaccinated. So this just summarizes our take right now on where we are in terms of number of infections and deaths, and how that's going to be trending the rest of the year. So basically the top section table shows us what we're estimating is obviously Q1 has been a terrible quarter for the US and for a lot of other countries in terms of infections and deaths, but we really see that turning pretty substantially in the second quarter as more and more people are getting vaccinated. And so you can see the bottom graph here. This is showing average daily doses administered in the US, starting from kind of late January up until around the time that the J&J vaccine was launched. So this is just showing Moderna and Pfizer. But you can see that average has grown from just over 1 million doses a day to now we're well over 2 million. And I think that's going to continue to grow substantially as J&J begins to be able to supply much more significant amounts of vaccine going into early in the second quarter. And here too, this shows really kind of our view more forward looking of how we see the vaccination going in the US. And this would be split now, I've added into this graphic J&J and Novovax. J&J we see as a much more significant player. Novovax I think is going to just be a little bit later and kind of launching at a time where we've already vaccinated a significant number of people by May or June. But overall, you could see where we are on this trajectory. We're at a very interesting point because we're really at the point where the trajectory of this curve is changing. And so I think that new trajectory we're going to be on is going to be supporting around 70 million doses being administered per month. And that's very similar actually to the number of doses per month that are administered for flu vaccines in the fall. So that's not, and that's something that's generally been supported by pharmacies and doctors' offices. And here we have a situation where I think it's really going to be a combination of pharmacies and some of these federally supported vaccination sites, but then also all the work that the states have been doing to create vaccination sites as well. So this equates overall, you can see the black line on this graph showing the percentage of the population in the US that has been vaccinated. So what we're assuming based on this kind of trajectory is that we could see 68% of the population vaccinated by the end of the third quarter. So that would be about 80% of adults and about 20% of children. And we're assuming children could be eligible for vaccination starting in the third quarter. So maybe going a little bit into, I want to very briefly touch on some of the assumptions we made for our herd immunity estimates. So just so everyone's on the same page, herd immunity is looking at really when the virus would get to the point where it would run out of susceptible individuals to infect. So a lot of times you'll see this R0 estimate for an infection rate. And what that number is really just saying, how many people does each infected person then go on to infect? And so for very contagious diseases like measles, that can be 14 people. For COVID, that is average more like 2 or 3 people. And so that infection rate is actually increasing slightly with the more contagious variants. So what we've assumed in our estimates is infection rate closer to 3. There are also a lot of other questions that go into coming up with a herd immunity forecast and that we've conducted in our analysis. So one question would be how many people are already infected, which is actually a tougher question than you would think because there are just so many people who were never diagnosed because they never made it to get a diagnosis, or they maybe didn't even have any symptoms and were completely unaware that they were sick. So those estimates we've seen some good estimates from CDC and Yale School of Public Health, somewhere probably in the mid 20% of the US population infected at the end of last year. We assumed similar to that. We also assume that that's going to be growing to almost 40% by the end of the first quarter, just given how hard we've been hit this quarter. So that actually, we think that's going to be providing some help in terms of getting to herd immunity, particularly since so many of these infections were very recent. We're unlikely to see reinfection among people who've been infected so recently. And then on efficacy of vaccines, that's another big factor in whether the vaccines will help with herd immunity. Again, as I mentioned, very effective mRNA vaccines, slightly less effective vector vaccines. And so we've assumed efficacy in the US somewhere around 90%, just taking into account vaccination with other vaccines that might allow the virus to continue to spread and cause less severe disease, but still allow the virus to continue to spread. And then another question, how fast can we actually give these vaccines? As I mentioned, 70 million doses a month for flu. That's kind of the benchmark we used for the speed we could achieve. And then finally, how many people get the vaccine? Surveys have been, I'd say, averaging somewhere around 70% of the population being interested. As I said, we're assuming closer to 80% of adults could be vaccinated by the end of the third quarter. Childhood vaccines, I think that rate would be kind of the high end of what would be achievable. That's closer to 90%. We think vaccination rates could be higher than average just because, we have seen quite a bit of renewed interest in vaccination, and the shortages and the desire to end this pandemic, we're thinking there could be just continued interest over the next few months in getting to herd immunity and ending the pandemic. So here's a graphic of what we see happening in the US. We're assuming herd immunity in June. So kind of throwing all these assumptions together in terms of how contagious the virus is, how effective the vaccine is, we assume that you need to have 74% of people protected in order to get to herd immunity. That's our base case. And so this graph basically shows in blue everyone who's been vaccinated, in orange everyone who has been infected. And so that combination reaches 74% in June. And then globally, the graph looks a little different for really a couple reasons. One of the main reasons would be that we're assuming vaccine efficacy could be slightly lower overall because there's going to be less access to the mRNA vaccines and more reliance on the slightly less effective Astrazeneca and J&J vaccines, which just means you have to vaccinate more people in order to get to herd immunity. Also, access is coming a little bit later, so you see the kind of a slower ramp in vaccination. And so that really never reaches the point of our base case herd immunity here globally, which is why we do continue to think that globally we'll continue to see transmission of the current virus and some new variants. So here again, going back to our coverage universe, this just shows, again, kind of our star ratings and moat ratings, but then also focuses in on the types of COVID products that these companies are selling and some of our sales estimates for 2021 and how that compares to consensus. And so I just highlight, it's really kind of three categories of products here. The vaccines we've already talked about quite a bit, coming from Astra, BioNTech, Pfizer, but also, the antibodies are another category that are seeing at least significant sales through government contracts, if not, not really seeing very large uptake in the public just because they're tougher to administer. But the companies that are seeing sales from that would include Lilly and Regeneron, and Roche is also partnered with Regeneron on that same antibody. And then also the kind of the third group would be kind of other treatments. So Gilead with their antiviral Veklury, and then Merck is in an interesting position. They have two, they actually have halted their development of vaccines, but they have two treatments that are still in testing. One of these is an antiviral that's actually oral, which if they are able to show efficacy similar to Gilead's Veklury or potentially better efficacy, this would be something that would be much more convenient to give to patients who are not yet admitted to a hospital, don't yet have severe disease. So we think that's something that we do have a placeholder in our model for, but I think there could be significant potential for that, not only for treating individuals who are infected later this year, but also potentially for stockpiling for future potential pandemics as well. And so just going into a few of the more specifics on some of the names that we cover that are branded large cap and also have some kind of COVID exposure as well. So Astrazeneca, so this is a company that we see as slightly undervalued now, a wide moat name. It's had broad exposure to respiratory disease, diabetes, and oncology. I'd say this has been a company where the pipeline has really just had success after success recently. It's been a very popular name. A lot of the progress that they've been seeing has been in oncology. So drugs like Tagrisso, Imfinzi, Calquence, and HER2, a lot of these products are just seeing extremely strong uh, efficacy and also seeing expanding efficacy into new areas. And so you can see in this graphic, a lot of these newer products are really driving really significant sales growth over the next several years. In terms of COVID, yes, Astra does actually, they have a vaccine. As I mentioned, we don't model that. We actually don't include that in our model because Astra has excluded it from their guidance. And we also don't include it because we were not certain that it would actually get US approval. It's not for profit, so it's not something that we would expect to affect valuation anyway. They also do have an antibody program. It's slightly behind some of the other programs, so it's not something that we've kind of really decided to include substantially in our model. So BioNTech, I mentioned this is the smaller company on the list among these names. We haven't yet assigned it a moat rating. We've given it a no moat, I should say. That's the COVID vaccine community is something that has really proven the ability of this mRNA technology to succeed. But the question here becomes, with moat ratings, we're looking at long-term competitive advantages. The question here becomes, what is this going to be repeating annual or chronic sales for this product? And what does this mean for the rest of their pipeline? So as you can see in this graphic, the way we model it right now, we have very significant gross profit from the vaccine in 2021, also in 2022. But 2023 forward, what we're modeling there is really a mix of potential probability weighted sales from a lot of different oncology programs, which is really kind of where BioNTech was focused before the pandemic. So we see these as higher risk programs. There's a lot less validation for this technology working in oncology as opposed to working in as preventing infectious disease. And so that's one of the reasons why we haven't been as on board with valuation or with giving them a moat. I do think that if there is a booster market that becomes chronic, their technology does make it easier to modify. So this mRNA technology really is much easier than some older technologies in terms of just substituting in a new genetic sequence for whatever variant you need, and then kind of just plug and play, basically, is what they say, but plugging it into the system that they already have developed for manufacturing these vaccines. And then Lilly, so Lilly is a name that we do see as slightly overvalued at this point. It's a name that has been probably best known for its diabetes, insulin therapies, and some newer novel GLP-1 therapies, but also known in immunology and oncology as well. In COVID, they have been seeing higher sales of an arthritis therapy that has combined well with Gilead's antiviral Veklury. That has gotten emergency use authorization now. And as I mentioned, they're also selling an antibody cocktail, which has seen some pretty significant US government contracts. They have seen less use just because it's tough to administer an intravenous antibody cocktail to patients who aren't yet hospitalized, which is kind of really where they're focused on these patients who aren't severely ill yet. But the efficacy has been very strong in preventing patients who do get treated from being hospitalized. So I think it does still represent a very solid innovation coming from the company. And then this graphic just shows overall Trulicity, one of their GLP-1 therapies, that's going to be counteracting the patent losses they're going to be seeing over the next few years. But they do have a pretty diversified portfolio beyond that that's going to be supporting growth over the next few years as well. So Gilead, as I mentioned, Gilead is actually one of the names that we would highlight as one of our favorites right now. It's a wide moat name. That wide moat has been established based on their HIV portfolio and also their experience in hepatitis. We think that their moat trend here is stable, meaning that that wide moat looks particularly stable over the next 10 to 20 years. And this is really based on a combination of current products. So Biktarvy, their really key HIV treatment, has patent protection through 2033, but they're also making significant progress building their oncology pipeline. So you can see, so this graph shows sales through 2025. You can see, this is a little impacted because 2020 included a lot of Veklury sales, which distorts things a bit. But oncology is really going to be a big driver for them. And it could be an even bigger driver than this based on some upcoming data over 2021 and 2022 for a lot of the newer products that have been added to their portfolio over the past year. So I think Gilead looks undervalued from the perspective of really a lot of their continuing franchises and their move into oncology. I think Veklury has been kind of creating some volatility around the name, and we do see that as more of just a short-term driver for the company. And at this point, it's not something that we would assume would see long-term sales. J&J, just quickly, this is a name we see as more fairly valued. Their vaccine is also not for profit, so it's not something that's really affecting our valuation here at this point. Merck, another name I wanted to highlight as one that we see as undervalued. A lot of this does come from their oncology drug, Keytruda. And what's going to be coming up here this year is some new data for Keytruda in lung cancer for more early stage patients. And so this is an area where it's not entirely proven yet. We assume a 70% chance it could work. If it does, this opens up an additional $10 billion market opportunity where Merck would be one of the leading companies that could compete. So really Merck's growth is coming from Keytruda and also Gardasil, their HPV vaccine, as well as their animal health business has been driving growth, as you can see in this graphic from our pipeline report last year. In terms of COVID, as I mentioned, there is potential upside if their antiviral program sees positive data because that program is oral. They should be seeing data here, I think, within the next, potentially later this month or in the second quarter. Pfizer, so Pfizer, a name that we see as perhaps slightly undervalued, very diversified name. They actually do have a for-profit vaccine program. So it's one that they share with BioNTech for their gross profits. I think that, if you think about the names that are most likely to see long-term benefit from COVID related sales, Pfizer would be one of the names to bet on. As I mentioned, the mRNA technology is very adaptable in terms of being able to adapt to new variants and create new boosters as needed. Regeneron, I mentioned, this is a name that in terms of COVID does have an antibody cocktail that they're selling. Some of the same limitations as the Lilly antibody because it does need to be infused and in patients who aren't yet hospitalized. But overall, Regeneron is named, again, perhaps slightly undervalued, very strong portfolio in immunology and oncology, some of this through collaborations with Sanofi. And then Roche, just highlight the last name here. This is another name that we have on our best ideas list. We see it as more than 30% undervalued. So this is a name that, when it comes to COVID, has really benefited from their leadership in diagnostics. So their diagnostics, molecular diagnostics, has just really soared over this time. But they've also seen sales of one of their immunology therapies, Actemra, that has had some data indicating that it works particularly well in patients who are extremely ill and hospitalized. So very different from what we've seen with the antibody cocktails and with Veklury. And so, so when it comes to Roche and valuation, we really see growth coming from, they've had this huge biosimilar hit from older oncology therapies that's really hitting in the US 2020, 2021. But they also have extremely strong growth coming from newer drugs that have already been launched in oncology, hemophilia, multiple sclerosis, so kind of across the board. A lot of, I guess we'd say a lot of proof of innovation across oncology and neurology in particular, and again, a strong diagnostics portfolio that is very complementary to their drug portfolio as well. So maybe with that, I can turn it back to Lauren. Now that I've gotten through the slides, we can turn it over to questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Karen, for that excellent and comprehensive overview. It's wonderful to hear so many exciting things happening on both the investment and public health landscape as a result of these companies. So it's great to hear. So for the audience, we have some time for Karen to answer questions on your mind. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom menu to submit them. And while you are typing those in, I'd be happy to kick it off. Karen, something that I've been wondering, hearing about this really exciting mRNA technology, what does it mean for, I guess, flu vaccines in the flu market? And then even, more broadly outside of that, potentially the ability for this technology to compete with more established drug firms?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And the flu market, maybe I'll just start with that. I mean, that's an area where we've had, as I mentioned, I kind of referred to that as, allowing us to build our estimates for how quickly we could dose with the COVID shots. But historically, there's just been terrible efficacy for flu vaccines. I mean, I think often it's less than 50% effective. Pricing has been fairly low. I mean, the global market, I think, is about a $4 billion market led by companies like Sanofi and Glaxo. I think that this new technology could really be game changing here. I think it could not only, being able to basically being able to modify these vaccines so easily means that the mRNA firms could have more information when they design the flu shots, meaning, all these companies basically have to guess whatever variants or strains are going to be spreading when they start the manufacturing process. And it's such a long process with the older technology using cells and eggs. But with this mRNA technology, they would have more time to see what's developing. They could, quickly put in whatever sequence they need to for mRNA in order to target the right flu strains that are spreading. And so I think that could really increase efficacy. And with increased efficacy, I think you could also see a lot more interest among the general public in getting flu shots. I also think just in terms of sales, it could probably also support slightly higher pricing as well. And then finally, I'd say really the really interesting thing here is that you could, the mRNA technology, these are just small pieces of genetic sequence. You can put several of these together in one shot. And so we could start to see vaccines that are combination vaccines. I think Pfizer and Moderna have both talked about that. They're both entering development this year with their flu vaccine programs. And I think down the road, once those start to get some data, we could start to see combination shots, which would just make it, I think, even easier. But as I said, there's a lot of unknowns in terms of how often we would actually need coronavirus vaccines to figure out how that combination would work. But then in terms of just bigger picture, how is the mRNA technology going to affect some of these more established technologies and established companies? this has just been a huge validation for the mRNA technology, getting these COVID vaccines through development and commercialized, and with extremely strong safety and efficacy. I mean, now these have been given to millions of patients with very solid safety profiles. So Moderna, I'd say, Moderna is an interesting company to look at because I think they've taken a much broader view of the potential of the mRNA vaccines in terms of their clinical pipeline. So they're trying to use mRNA for all types of treatments, including making therapeutic proteins. So that could be something that could really directly compete with approved proteins and antibody treatments. But I would say that this kind of prophylactic vaccine we've seen for COVID, it's very different from trying to administer mRNA to make an ongoing replacement of a protein in the body. So for the COVID vaccine, you really only need to have a small amount of this spike protein from coronavirus made in order to trigger an immune response. So that's very different from like a therapeutic level of a protein. So we're still at the point where we're looking at this technology. Moderna is a company, we actually don't cover them. We're still kind of assessing their valuation and their technology. But I think the biggest potential really for Moderna over the next 10 years is going to be looking more at vaccines for infectious diseases beyond COVID, and then potentially in oncology too. I think there's also kind of a strong argument that you could use mRNA to really help the immune system learn how to fight cancer. And that could be done with programs like mRNA vaccines that could be given to a broad range of people, but it could also be more personalized shots that are based on the specific type of cancer that an individual has. But overall, I'd say these technologies are more validated now in infectious disease, but it's still pretty early in some other areas.
Thank you. And then, turning back to this idea of like a booster or a third shot, do you think that Pfizer and Moderna will still have an edge in that market, or do we not have enough data to know yet?
Yeah, I mean, at least initially with this, the first response against the pandemic, obviously Pfizer and Moderna have had a huge lead. But when it comes to the booster market, I mean, it could be slightly different. As I said, these are the two companies that have already started trials for their booster shots for having a third dose of the same vaccine. And both of these companies have large scale and are continuing to build scale going into 2022. But I'd say that going forward, we could also see some other players come into the mix that could also contribute pretty substantially to the booster market. One of these would be Novovax. As I mentioned, Novovax is one that's seen very solid efficacy so far. We're still waiting for the US trial to probably read out in May, but they've had strong data. They use a different more established technology, actually, one kind of an older vaccine technology, but still one that can be adapted if there are changes. And they also have capacity for, a number of doses in the billions. And so I think that it probably will likely be, if we do end up needing boosters, the companies that probably seem most likely to be able to adapt quickly and have had strong efficacy would be the mRNA vaccines and Novavax.
Okay. Thank you. Question submitted about the idea of some companies being for profit, even though subsidiaries that received funds from the government to fund R&D. So the question is about, do you have any assumptions for the ROI, from COVID vaccines that are from firms that are for profit, or do you have that level of visibility into the assumptions?
Oh, yeah, no, that's probably something I don't have as much visibility on. Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to investment from the government, Moderna is probably the key one that comes to mind that has had significant investment in terms of supporting their development and supporting just the progress of the company getting to the point where they could have a commercial vaccine. Pfizer, I think, has been a lot more separate. They weren't part of the Operation Warp Speed. They were just part of. They were only part of it at the point where the U.S. was signing contracts to actually buy a commercial product. So I think with companies like Moderna, I think it becomes more of a question of how much of, yeah, how much of the investment was coming from the government. And I think returns are going to depend. And another huge uncertainty is kind of how pricing will change once we get through these initial contracts. So the way the U.S. contracts were set up, there's kind of established pricing for, each bucket of 100 million doses. And so once we get past that, I think it's maybe 500 million or so doses that are included among all the options. That's where I think pricing could change. And I think there's been some noise from companies like Pfizer and Moderna basically saying pricing could go up. I don't think it would go up substantially. I mean, I think the vaccine market in general is not one that supports, pricing in the, hundreds of dollar range. But I think there could be, upside to the kind of pricing where, we've been more like in the $30 to $40 range so far.
Thank you. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting public health discussion on that area.
Yeah, for sure.
Another question is, can you talk a little bit about the timeline for when kids could be vaccinated and the expectations there?
Yeah, no, that's a big question, and it also kind of ties in with the idea of herd immunity, because I mean it's not an insignificant portion of the population under the age of 18. And so Pfizer actually has already gotten approval for ages 16 and up. So that's some small portion of teenagers that are able to get the Pfizer vaccine. But when it comes to children under 16, so we assume there could be enough data to start vaccinating kids 12 and up by late summer. That's what I mentioned in that one graph, that in the third quarter we could start vaccinating kids. That would really just be ages 12 and up. There are ongoing studies from Pfizer and Moderna among those kids. And these trials are not, this is not the same as the adult trials in the sense where you have to just, enroll 30,000 people and wait for people to get sick. This is something where they're administering vaccine and they're basically making sure that the kids are having similar immune responses. They're making similar amounts of neutralizing antibodies as what the adults have made in their clinical trials for adults. So it's going to be a much shorter process in evaluating safety and then this more limited efficacy. And then in younger kids, that's literally just starting right now. I think with Moderna just had a release today talking about starting a study in kids down to 6 months. And so that category, I think, probably would not be vaccinated until, at the earliest, it would be very late this year, but probably early 2022.
Okay, well, I think we are just about out of time. Oh, we have one more sneak in. I think we have time to get it to it. So a question about herd immunity, and that, how is it created from antibodies that the body creates naturally from exposure to the virus? What is that assumption based on? For the effectiveness of the natural antibodies created by the virus versus that from a vaccine? And is there a difference, and how do we have a basis for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been, over the past several months, we've seen more and more data reading out as time goes by since people were infected and as time goes by since they were vaccinated, kind of monitoring their antibody levels, monitoring their looking at their T cell levels as well. So there's a lot of factors that are tied to a patient's ability to respond very quickly if they're exposed again. And so, I mean, I think we're always limited in terms of the amount of time we've had to monitor this and really knowing how long immunity will last. And it has been a bit variable too. So, there's some people who were exposed and infected and had just very mild cases. And usually those people have lower levels of antibodies. So as those antibodies fade, it might be less able to actually protect them from infection. And so I think that clearly vaccination is a much stronger protection. There's a lot of controversy about how long people are protected who have been infected, how well protected they are. But if you go back and look at my graphic, that's one of the reasons I actually split it into two categories so that you can look at, well, what happens if you assume most people who have been infected, actually aren't protected? What if you assume most of them could get infected again and spread it to other people who then could get very sick? I think if you look at that graphic, it would just essentially mean that it would push herd immunity out a few months. So if you assume no one who's been infected or protected, which I think is extremely unreasonable, if you assume that, it would be towards the end of this year that we could get to herd immunity. But I would say the vast majority of people who have been infected do have some protection and would be much less likely to get sick and much less likely to spread the disease to others.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you again for your time and your expertise. We're so grateful for you joining us and presenting your research. And thank you to the audience for joining us. We look forward to seeing you virtually at our next event on April 13th. We hope to see you there. Thank you and have a great week.